Alright, welcome back to the Recipe Analyst. Today we're going to be making Campari and Orange Sticky Ribs from the Italian American Cookbook. This recipe uses a lot of garlic, so I have to steal 1 clove from this head of garlic to have 4 cloves that I'm going to grate that ends up going into the rub. You don't have to remove the skin from the garlic when you're grating it like this because the skin doesn't go through the grater, so it can save you a little bit of time. Next, I'm going to make sure that my ribs are going to fit on this sheet pan, and then I'm going to remove the membrane from the bottom of the ribs. The recipe says to wash off your ribs, but just like chicken, you shouldn't do that. You can just pat them dry and they should be fine. So removing the membrane can be a little bit difficult, especially if you've never done it before. So you can see here that I'm kind of struggling to get it off. And a trick that people tell you is you can use a paper towel to get more grip, which does work, but it only works once you have the membrane started. So what I like to do is get it started just with my finger by trying to put it between the bone or the meat and the membrane. And then once you have it started like this, you can grab it with the paper towel and then peel it on off. Never had luck with it coming off in one big piece, but as long as you get it off, you should be fine. And here I'm just getting it unstuck from the meat and the bone again, and then peeling it off with the paper towel. And do the same thing on the other rib, of course. Now I'm gonna go ahead and get the rub ready. I'm gonna start by zesting an orange. Make sure you get everything that's stuck to the underside of your grater. Then add 3 tablespoons of salt. Then 2 teaspoons of ground ginger. And for the black pepper, when I'm grating it fresh, I don't really ever measure it out. I kind of go by eye, so you could use the 2 teaspoons. I think it's 2 teaspoons of black pepper, or you can just go by eye. And then a 1/4 cup of olive oil. And then drop the garlic in there. Usually you don't want to add the bowl, but this time I accidentally added the bowl. Give it a good mix, and then you can add that to the ribs. Instead of touching it, I just use a spoon to spread it out. Typically rubs like this, from my experience, they really like to stick to your hands, and your hands get super oily, and there's garlic in here, so your hands will really smell like garlic. So I just use a spoon to spread it all over. And I barely had enough to cover these ribs completely. And then I'm going to wrap them tightly in aluminum foil. And if you use smaller ribs, the recipe says to use 2 to 4 pounds ribs. I had a little bit more than that. You'll probably have just enough of the rub. So I'll put that in the oven to bake for about 2 hours. I ended up baking it for a little more than 2 hours. You'll see later, at 300 degrees. Now we're going to work on the garlic. And this garlic is going in the sauce. And as usual, since we're not grating it this time, I'm going to go ahead and peel the garlic before I chop it up. Once again, I'm not a professional chef, so my knife skills aren't that great. Not that you need to be a professional to be good at using a knife. Next, I'm going to go ahead and chop the ginger. You can peel it by using the edge of a spoon, then just chop it up into small pieces until you have about a tablespoon of chopped ginger. Next, I'm going to squeeze the lemon and the orange. You just need 2 tablespoons of lemon juice, so about 1 lemon should be fine. And we need a cup of orange juice, so I'm going to use the juice from the orange that I had, and then for the rest I'm just going to use this bottled juice. I'm going to measure out the honey. Really, you should go ahead and measure out everything at this point, but I kind of stopped there for some reason. Now I'm adding 2 tablespoons of oil to this pot. Add the ginger and the garlic to the pot. As well as 2 tablespoons of salt. And then just stir that around, and we're going to let that go until it is slightly golden brown. And to make your life a little bit easier, like I said, you could measure out all this stuff ahead of time, but once the garlic and ginger is golden brown, we're going to pour in the Campari, a cup of rice vinegar, the honey, and then the sugar. Stir that together and make sure all the sugar is dissolved, and we're just going to bring that to a boil. Once it's at a boil, we're going to lower its temperature and let it simmer until it's nice and thick. I let it simmer for almost an hour and 10 minutes. The bubbles are supposed to get pretty big, and it's supposed to coat the back of a spoon like this. And I stirred in the 2 tablespoons of the lemon juice. And here's a better view of what coating the back of a spoon looks like. It leaves a little trail when you run your finger through it. So after 2 hours, the ribs came out, and I tested them with the pointy end of the knife. They weren't quite tender enough for me, so I put them back in for another 20 minutes, and they seem to be a little bit more tender now. So I'm going to cover those back up and let them cool. Once they're cool enough to handle, I go ahead and cut them into individual ribs. I would recommend just using a cutting board to do this. Then you won't have to worry about hitting your knife on the metal or anything. It's just a lot safer. I was just a little lazy and didn't want to end up having to clean the cutting board at the end of this. With the ribs cut into individual pieces, I'm just going to pour the sauce over and then give it a little mix or toss to make sure they're all well coated. And the sauce seems a little thinner than I expected. Maybe I was supposed to boil it down a little bit more to make it thicker, but the recipe says to go until it coats the back of a spoon, and that's what I did. It also says you're supposed to have 1.5 to 2 cups, but that's kind of hard to tell in a pot like this. So at this point, the ribs are pretty much done, so I'll let you know what I thought of them. I'm gonna give these ribs a 5 out of 10, and it's mostly because of the flavor. The texture is fine, they're plenty tender, but the flavor is mainly just sweetness, some bitterness, and a very slight hint of orange. Of course, you can get the rib flavor as well, just from the pork, but the sauce isn't my favorite sauce by a long shot. The Campari adds that bitterness, and I'm sure some sweetness as well. Um, but it's not bitter in a good way. It's just in a weird way. It's hard to describe. It doesn't really fit with ribs, in my opinion. Um, but yeah, the ribs by themselves without the sauce, they taste better than with the sauce. So I kind of feel like making the sauce and buying the alcohol was kind of a waste. Anyway, thanks for watching. If you want a more in-depth analysis, you could always go to therecipeanalyst.com for more details. Thanks.